For most of the Cold War, the United States believed speed solved problems, not as a slogan, as doctrine. If an aircraft could fly faster than anything else, higher than anything else, and farther than anything else, then interception became irrelevant. That belief produced some of the most extreme machines ever built, none more so than the SR-71 Blackbird. At Mach 3, speed wasn't just performance, it was immunity. The logic was sound. Fighters couldn't climb fast enough. Missiles struggled with closure rates. Radar detection didn't matter if nothing could respond in time. The Blackbird didn't evade threats, it invalidated them. And for years, it worked. But inside the U.S. defense community, something uncomfortable began to surface. Not publicly, not dramatically. Quietly, in after-action reports, exercises, and planning rooms. Speed solved one problem very well. It created another. The faster and higher the aircraft flew, the narrower its operating envelope became. Thermal limits, fuel constraints, navigation accuracy, predictable routes, predictable timing. These weren't weaknesses, but they were constraints. And constraints invite thinking. This wasn't about an enemy catching the Blackbird. It was about an enemy planning around it. As American reconnaissance flights continued, air defense analysts, both U.S. and foreign, started asking different questions. Not how do we shoot it down, but how do we know where it will be? Not how do we chase it, but how do we already be there? These weren't theoretical questions, they were practical ones. Because speed creates dependency. A Mach 3 aircraft cannot loiter, it cannot maneuver freely, it cannot deviate often without consequences. Routes must be optimized, timing must be precise, efficiency becomes survival. The United States understood this, so did everyone else, and that realization slowly changed how American planners thought about air power, not in headlines, not in public statements, but in how new systems were designed, tested, and prioritized. Speed was still valuable, but it was no longer enough on its own. Exercises began to emphasize coordination over pursuit, detection over interception, timing over reaction. The goal shifted from catching the fast aircraft to rendering its speed irrelevant to the mission outcome. This wasn't a rejection of speed, it was an evolution beyond it. And that evolution didn't come from failure, it came from success. Because the Blackbird worked so well, it revealed the limits of relying on a single advantage. It forced planners to confront a reality that aviation history repeats over and over. Every extreme creates a counter-extreme. By the late Cold War, the United States still fielded the fastest aircraft ever built, but its confidence no longer rested on speed alone. It rested on systems, on integration, on knowing that winning airspace wasn't about being untouchable, it was about being unavoidable. That shift didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen by accident. In the next part, we'll look at what specifically changed inside U.S. planning and why the fastest jet in history quietly pushed America toward a very different kind of air power. The change didn't begin with a new aircraft. It began with uncomfortable questions. Inside U.S. planning circles, analysts were forced to separate tactical invincibility from strategic usefulness. The SR-71 could outrun anything, that was never in doubt, but speed alone did not guarantee that the intelligence it gathered would always translate to decisive advantage. Because intelligence is only valuable if it arrives in time, in context, and in a form that can be acted upon. At Mach 3, reconnaissance windows were brief. Coverage was linear. Sensors had to be optimized for straight-line flight. Targets had to be prioritized long before takeoff. The Blackbird could not orbit, linger, or dynamically retask without cost. These were engineering realities, not failures. As long as the mission was purely strategic, mapping, verification, broad surveillance, the model worked exceptionally well. But as conflicts became more complex, planners began to ask whether speed was solving the right problem. By the late Cold War, air defense thinking had shifted. The challenge was no longer just stopping aircraft. It was understanding patterns, predicting routes, anticipating timing, coordinating sensors across regions rather than reacting locally. Ironically, the very discipline that made Mach 3 flight possible also made it modelable. High-speed aircraft cannot afford improvisation. Fuel margins shrink, thermal loads rise, navigation tolerances tighten. To stay safe, routes become repeatable, timing becomes reliable. And reliability, in military planning, is a two-edged sword. The United States recognized this dynamic not as a vulnerability, but as a design constraint that had implications beyond reconnaissance. It influenced how future air power would be structured. Instead of chasing speed, emphasis shifted toward persistence. Satellites began to take on a larger role, not because they were better at everything, but because they could stay, they could revisit, they could provide context over time. They didn't need to sprint through defended airspace to matter. At the same time, airborne early warning systems grew in importance. Rather than relying on individual aircraft to outrun threats, the focus moved to seeing the battlespace earlier and more completely. If you know what is coming, speed becomes less decisive. This thinking extended into fighter doctrine as well. Rather than building aircraft that relied on one overwhelming advantage, the U.S. began prioritizing integration. Sensors, data links, electronic warfare, and coordinated response mattered more than raw performance in any single dimension.
The goal was no longer to be unreachable. It was to be informed first. Speed still mattered, but it became one variable among many, not the defining feature. The lessons learned from operating at Mach 3 fed into a broader understanding. Air power wins not by outrunning reality, but by shaping it. The SR-71 didn't become obsolete because it was flawed. It became less central because warfare evolved. The problems that needed solving changed. Speed was an answer, but not always the answer. And the U.S. adjusted accordingly. This was not a public admission. There was no announcement that speed had limits, but quietly, budgets shifted. Concepts changed. New systems were designed to complement what speed could not provide. By learning from its fastest aircraft, the United States began building a force that relied less on extremes and more on balance. In the next part, we'll examine how this realization affected the aircraft that followed and why the future of air power moved away from chasing the next Mach number. The shift became visible not in what the United States said, but in what it built. After the Blackbird, there was no serious attempt to field another Mach 3 reconnaissance aircraft. That decision alone tells you how deeply the lesson had settled. If raw speed were the ultimate answer, the logical next step would have been Mach 4, then Mach 5. The technology roadmap existed on paper. The appetite did not. Instead, U.S. air power moved sideways. The next generation of systems focused less on outrunning threats and more on controlling information. Sensors became distributed. Platforms became interconnected. The emphasis shifted from individual aircraft performance to how well the system worked as a whole. This was not accidental. Operating the SR-71 had made one thing clear. Extreme performance demands extreme predictability. Every Mach 3 flight was a compromise between heat, fuel, routing, and timing. That trade-off was acceptable for strategic reconnaissance. It was far less attractive for a broader set of missions. Air combat, surveillance, and strike operations were becoming increasingly dynamic. Targets moved, threats adapted, political constraints changed rapidly. A platform that had to commit hours in advance, follow narrow corridors, and accept limited flexibility simply didn't fit every problem. The U.S. didn't abandon speed, it contextualized it. Look at what followed. The emphasis moved toward aircraft that could operate inside defended airspace not by outrunning it, but by understanding it. Electronic warfare became central rather than supplemental. Stealth wasn't treated as invisibility, but as time. Time to observe, time to decide, time to act. This is where many casual narratives get it wrong. The transition away from speed wasn't driven by fear of interception. The SR-71 was never caught. What changed was the realization that winning the air war meant more than surviving the flight. It meant influencing outcomes over hours and days, not just minutes. A fast aircraft can pass through danger. A persistent system can shape it. That logic drove investment into airborne command and control, electronic intelligence, and networked fighters. Information dominance became the new altitude advantage. Knowing first mattered more than arriving fastest. This also explains why newer U.S. fighters didn't chase extreme speed numbers. The F-15, F-16, F-18, and later the F-22 all balanced performance rather than maximizing a single metric. They were fast enough, but more importantly, they were aware, connected, and adaptable. Speed without context creates blind spots. The SR-71's legacy inside U.S. planning wasn't go faster, it was don't depend on one edge. And this lesson wasn't theoretical. Exercises demonstrated it repeatedly. Red teams learned that predicting routes mattered more than intercepting them. Blue teams learned that denying information often mattered more than destroying platforms. By the time the Cold War ended, the United States had quietly internalized something that many outside observers missed. The future of air power wouldn't be won by the aircraft that pushed physics the hardest. It would be won by the force that reduced uncertainty the fastest. That's why satellites replaced some reconnaissance roles, why unmanned platforms gained importance, why data fusion became a priority long before the term became fashionable. The Blackbird didn't fail, it taught. And what it taught reshaped doctrine far beyond reconnaissance. In the final part, we'll pull this together. What was truly earned from building the fastest jet in history, and why the most valuable lesson wasn't about speed at all.
What the United States ultimately earned from building the fastest jet in history wasn't superiority, it was perspective. The SR-71 Blackbird delivered exactly what it promised. It flew higher and faster than anything before or since, gathered intelligence no other platform could reach at the time, and did so reliably under extreme conditions. It validated decades of engineering effort and operational discipline. In that sense, it was a complete success. But its greatest contribution came after that success. By pushing speed and altitude to their limits, the Blackbird exposed what those limits actually cost. Every Mach number gained narrowed flexibility. Every extra mile of altitude reduced options. Extreme performance demanded extreme planning, and extreme planning reduced adaptability. None of this made the aircraft weak, but it made the trade-offs impossible to ignore. That realization changed how air power was valued. Instead of asking, how do we go faster, planners began asking, how do we know more? Instead of asking, how do we avoid everything, they asked, how do we shape what matters? The answers didn't point toward another Blackbird. They pointed toward networks, persistence, and decision advantage. Satellites didn't replace aircraft because they were perfect. They replaced some missions because they removed timing pressure. They could revisit, correlate, confirm. Unmanned systems followed for similar reasons, not because they were untouchable, but because they could stay long enough to matter. Fighters evolved the same way. Speed remained important, but it stopped being the center of gravity. Situational awareness, electronic warfare, coordination, and data fusion became the real force multipliers. A jet that could see first and act first mattered more than one that could briefly outrun danger. This wasn't a retreat from ambition, it was a refinement of it. The U.S. didn't abandon speed because it failed, it moved beyond it because it understood what speed alone could not deliver. The Blackbird didn't expose a flaw in American thinking, it completed it. And that's why the aircraft occupies such a unique place in aviation history. It wasn't the beginning of a race, it was the end of one. After the SR-71, air power stopped chasing extremes for their own sake. The focus shifted to systems that could absorb uncertainty rather than outrun it, to forces that could adapt instead of committing everything to a single advantage. That lesson remains relevant today. Every era produces its own fastest, highest, or most advanced platform, and every era eventually learns the same truth. Dominance isn't about pushing one dimension to the limit. It's about understanding how all dimensions interact. The Blackbird proved how far speed could take you. Its legacy is showing why speed was never the destination. It was the teacher. If this changed how you think about air power, you're not alone. Most breakthroughs in aviation don't come from winning a fight. They come from understanding the limits of winning one. If you want more stories like this, grounded in facts, not hype, stay here. There are many lessons like this in aviation history, and most of them were earned the hard way.